Folks, you're very welcome today's seminar series. My name is Will Carey. I'm based on MTU, Munster Technological University. I'm having to remember to say that, as for those of you who are maybe not from Ireland, you may not realise, but we merged into Munster Technological University on the 1st of January, bringing together Cork Institute of Technology and Institute of Technology. So I may well slip into saying CIT every now and again, but I will aim for the MTU name as much as I can. So Maurice, just over to you. I think you might want to say a few words of welcome as well.
A really warm welcome to everybody here. It's super to be in a room of people who take such interest in making learning better, and it comes, all of this teaching and learning piece comes with huge responsibility, and we are servants to our students. Actually, in the heel of the hunt, we are here for them. Student is a student is a student, and students first. But in my experience, it's easy to say that. In practice, actually, the student first agenda is only met if we work absolutely with our colleagues and our staff, because that's where the rubber meets the road. So look, it's very, very nice to have you here, Cathy. It's very nice to see so many of our colleagues here, and indeed colleagues and friends, increasingly from across the globe. I think we've got Dublin in the house, we have Limerick in the house, we have, I was looking at the list this morning, Sligo, Galway, Athlone, Dundalk, Carlow, Maynooth, Qatar, Portugal, the UK, USA, Canada. Maybe I've left some out. People have signed up. If they're not here in the moment, this morning we had over 100, I think, registrations for this morning's workshop. The workshop will be recorded and will be made available on the TLU website after the event. I think now, well, did you cover any of the housekeeping, or is there anything? I think that's where I'll finish and wish you luck on this, is it? But I'll hand back to Will because he knows what's coming next, Cathy. So thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. And just to, I suppose, a small plug. Maurice mentioned the breadth of folks from across the globe. Though I think some of that is in no small part to Cathy's Twitter following. The sort of and so if folks are on Twitter, it would encourage you to, as the National Forum video there said, to tweet away, but and to sort of and tag folks in. But I was looking back at the last conference, Cathy, that I think we were at together, which was the RAISE conference in the UK in September 2019. Little did we know what was coming up, but it was at that conference that I first heard Cathy link these two ideas of relational pedagogy and co-creation together. I actually went back to look at some of the Twitter messages that had been written about that session, and because that's what drew us to the forum, the submission to the forum. And so, folks, just a few, two or three little highlights that may sort of whet your appetite for why we were so pleased that Cathy accepted our invitation to come and talk today. In one tweet, someone was excited because they were going to hear from one of the leading lights of student engagement. I'm sure that we're excited to hear from that leading light today. Someone was talking about Cathy sharing about the diversity of ways to engage. There isn't just one, but there's many, and we've already heard and we've experienced actually some of those today in the setup for Cathy's session, she's encouraged us to engage in advance as well. And I've no doubt, having spoken to Cathy, that she's going to work as hard over the next couple of hours. I was also taken back, Cathy, to, and probably all of us are thinking that as well, the idea of a time when we were at conferences or we were at training sessions together and seminars where we could have coffees and we could have a chat and we could glance at someone over the table and say, oh, you know, did you get what they were saying there? And some of that is gone now. We have got some breakout rooms coming up, and I know that we're going to have a good amount of time in those breakout rooms as well. Folks, try and use some of that time to make some of those connections in different ways that might not be possible as we walk up the stairs or sit down at the table together. But we can do this in different ways. I know that we can do that. And then as we were talking at the start, a colleague from Cork was talking about the relational aspect and how important that is even more than ever. And one of the final things that I noted in a tweet from the conference in 2019, Cathy, was that you were making people think not about being students or staff, but you were encouraging people to think about each other as human beings with appreciating individual talents, and what can we bring into a space to co-create together. And so really delighted and thank you for what you're going to share with us. And I'd just like to say, folks, use the chat, use Twitter. If you feel it appropriate, use some of those reactions to let Cathy know how you're finding the session. And Cathy, over to you. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks so much, Will, for the very warm welcome, and to Maurice as well. It's absolutely fantastic to be with so many colleagues this morning from Ireland, but so much further afield as well. So really looking forward to some conversations and learning a little bit more about your practices, as well as me having an opportunity to share things with you. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So this morning, my name is on these slides, but also there are two other names that I'm going to introduce here. Now, they're not actually in the room yet. They're going to join us a little later, but in the spirit of co-creation, two postgraduate students from the USA who I taught last year, in February last year, are also going to join us a little bit later on to talk about their experiences of co-creation and relational pedagogies. So Caroline and Zoe will be joining us a little later on. You have to bear in mind that it's very early in North Carolina at the moment, so I thought we would bring them in after coffee this morning just to make it slightly later for them. But yeah, so this is going to be a joint endeavour in the sense that they're going to also contribute and add their perspectives and to the conversation. So this morning, the plan, if you like, is that I'm going to start with the first half, focused a little bit more on co-creation, and then come more to the sort of pedagogical relationships and relational teaching ideas after coffee. And I've put sort of about 10 to 11-ish will break for coffee, depending on how conversations are going and how we're getting on. But that just gives you an idea that there will be, so you know, there will be a short break for you to move around and away from the computer. But also we're going to have some small breakout groups, as Will said. So we'll start with some sort of introductions to co-creation. I want to introduce the idea of why I think we should be using classroom spaces more for co-creation and involving whole classes of students. So a little bit of discussion around that. And then we'll have a breakout group and a chance to hear back from breakout groups before coffee. And then, as I say, Zoe and Caroline will join us after coffee for sharing of their perspectives as we move into thinking about more relational teaching and the importance of relationships and setting a particular tone in the environment in which we're working with students. And again, there'll be opportunities for some small breakout groups and discussion with colleagues before we kind of come together for some concluding thoughts. So I hope that that's going to be helpful. Now, interestingly, I've realized the flaw in my plan here is that I'm going to have to come out from my slides for a second for this. What I'm going to ask you to do is just in the chat box function, and the reason I have to come out is because I can't see the chat box at the moment. It's one of the flaws of the way Zoom enables this sharing of screens, is I actually can't see what you're all saying when I'm presenting. But basically what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about what's your kind of energy level this morning. First thing, are you sort of in the zone of, oh wow, I need to go back to sleep, sort of 1 or 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, or I'm up for it and I'm excited, I'm up at sort of 9 or 10. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, which will enable me to see hopefully lots of numbers, yes, which have been popping into the chat box. So we've got some people. Mary is way up there at number 10, loads of energy this morning. Some others, maybe Larkin, you might need some caffeine. Jackie might need some caffeine as well. And Clodagh, I think, as well, potentially, and Cleona, coffee potentially being needed here. But it gives us, okay, directing student projects, yes, that column, that's going to have an impact. Great, we've got lots of people who have a lot of energy, but some people who maybe are feeling just like they need a little bit of a pep up. So I'm hoping that, as I say, some of the presentation will give you some energy, but also hopefully some conversations with colleagues very shortly will help along the way. And inhaling coffee is a new approach. I've not sort of approached my coffee in that way before. So I'll take us back to the screen. But yeah, there's a flaw there. I've just realized in Zoom that when you're actually in presentation mode, you can't actually see the chat box. So slightly frustrating there. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen again. So let's start to think about what we mean by co-creation. So here's one definition, and this comes from Tanya Lubitz-Narocka, who actually is a member of staff in the School of Education at the University of Edinburgh, and also a relatively recently completed PhD student who I was supervising. And Tanya talks about co-creation, and particularly in this case, curriculum co-creation, as values-based implementation of staff and students working together in an ongoing, reciprocal, creative and mutually beneficial process to negotiate and share decision-making. And what she draws out in that diagram is that when she's thinking about co-creation, and when she, in her research, she's really saw that people in defining co-creation were talking about sharing a set of values, and that being a really important part of co-creation, coming together to kind of to start to share the ways we think about learning and teaching. So some values underneath that might be things around the teacher not always being the person stood at the front of the room, for example. So starting to share values that the perspectives of everybody in the room need to be brought into learning and teaching for that to be something that's co-created. Creativity is a big part of co-creation. It's an interesting one. We sort of use the term co-creation, and yet half of that word is about creation, and we don't necessarily link it all the time to creativity. But that's absolutely what this is about people coming together to create and to produce knowledge. And so that kind of creativity is sort of something not to lose in this. And then a very important part of co-creation, I think, is that it's a negotiated process, something in which decision making is shared between staff and students, and therefore it's not always straightforward. Negotiation is not an easy thing to do, but is something that's absolutely at the heart of kind of co-creation. And another important part, mutual benefit. Sometimes we talk about reciprocity, and that's there in Tanya's definition. But yeah, there's some mutual benefit in there for all the people who are involved in that co-creation. So let's look at one of the things I asked you to do before coming to the session today, and some people will have had a chance to do this and some people may not. A shared PowerPoint slide which gave definitions of kind of co-creation, was one of the things I asked about. So I am going to put a couple of people on the spot, and if you don't want to, you don't have to come on screen for this, but I'm going to skip down a little through a few of these slides. I chose a few of them. I'm going to just pick on Ruth Harris if she's with us. And I don't know if Ruth is with us, but if she is, I'd love her to share with us about her co-creation picture and what this picture means to Ruth and why she put it here. Is Ruth with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry to pick on you, Ruth. I appreciate
it. Not at all. No. So the co-creation image, it was just something that kind of struck me. And for me, it's, I suppose, something organic.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that emerges. And I suppose that image for me is kind of the individual blossoming for each student of whatever it is they're engaged in. And for me, I see myself part of that co-creation very much so as well. So I suppose that's just something that struck me, that it can come out of very little, or it can be something much more systematic that you bring into the curriculum. But for me, I suppose sometimes I see co-creation emerging from what I do rather than maybe a whole planning around it.
That's lovely, Ruth. It's a really nice analogy that you've found and beautifully explained there in terms of its emergence and those kind of individual blossomings and the organic nature of it. So thank you for sharing that. Really lovely kind of idea of co-creation. Another slide that I do apologize for picking on people. If you'd rather not speak, I should say, please don't feel you have to. I'm going to pick on Will next, actually, just to explain your definition here of co-creation. I liked this.
Okay, Cathy, this was a sort of a last-minute homework. I thought, gosh, if we're organising the seminar with you, we can't not put something in. So it's. I think for me, there's a process of co-creation that is, and lots of things are happening within it, but that we're working towards something together. So there's a sense of being together and drawing on people's talents. But then I probably immediately jumped to co-creation in learning and teaching, because that was the seminar, but it was, I think, the making, developing, producing, woodworking in any case. But then I was drawing from experience and thinking, actually, quite a lot of the time, co-creation is messy. It's not linear. It's not simple. It's often finding a solution and together that's somewhere in the middle, that maybe not what either side necessarily thought that they wanted at the beginning. I put there potentially imperfect, because from one person's perspective, it might not be perfect, but as a shared thing, it is probably stronger and more rewarding than if we'd just gone it alone. That's personal experience. Others may differ from that. But I was actually trying to find a picture that suggested that there was a whole set of inputs, and there were some outputs that were coming, but those outcomes or those outputs were perhaps not what we were anticipating. And we see that with students, and we see that with staff in the work that we do. That we might have an end goal, and we may reach that, but quite often the joy and the excitement comes from things that we weren't anticipating. But that it's hard work at times. But
absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think I really liked the admission that this can be messy. It's not necessarily always straightforward or going in the way that you planned. So having an open mind to kind of be aware of the fact it might need to change along the way, I think is really important. But that also can be a bit stressful or feel a bit risky, I think, for a lot of staff and students. So that messiness, I think acknowledging that is important, and that potential imperfection of it, because it's lots of people coming together. So I really liked those elements of your sort of definition. So thank you, Will, for sharing. And one final one I was going to come to is Bridget's slide. I don't know if Bridget's with us. And because
Yeah,
there's a
I
lot.
am, sorry.
Oh, brilliant, Bridget. And would you sharing with us? You had a lovely picture for co-creation.
I suppose I did this really hurriedly after in between MEBs yesterday. So I suppose my whole idea was it was just to find a picture that represents kind of the students and teacher on equal footing and really working together to create something, you know, really simplistic, but that's really what I was thinking when I used this image. Sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. And I am aware that we didn't give you very long to do the homework, and I am aware how busy everybody is. So I really appreciate people who, you know, taking the time to do this. And one of the things I like about your picture is the fact that the teacher is doing work alongside the students, because I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding that co-creation is about handing everything over to the students. And I think it's really important that we hold on to the fact that the teacher is still a really important part of this process. So that was part of why I really liked your particular slide. So let me just stop sharing those slides. So thank you so much. Those, I know I picked on a few of you. I know I didn't pick on everybody, but there's an opportunity later I might pick on a few other people. But I really appreciate you being prepared to share your ideas there. So one of the reasons I did this with you is to sort of model one sort of approach to co-creation that I think is quite successful, that I've seen done in a range of places, is this idea of creating a shared pack of PowerPoint slides. This was an idea that came originally from some colleagues at University College of Northern Denmark. And you know, I thought this is really clever. They were teaching a course all about innovation, and they said, you know, the students have got ideas about what innovation is before they come to the course. It's not that they're going to learn everything from us. So they created this shared PowerPoint pack that people could add slides to, and they asked each of the students to add a slide. And then as they went through the teaching during the semester, they would visit that PowerPoint pack at different points during the semester. And they were saying it was brilliant because it meant that it changed it from just being them as the teacher speaking. And also that one kind of expected finding they had was that they said that student attendance was really good, because the students didn't know when their PowerPoint slides might be drawn upon. And so the students would come to every session. And they hadn't intended that at all. But what it did was it sort of, in a sense, democratized who was speaking by using this as a way of doing that. And I've certainly used it within some of my own teaching, and I think quite powerfully to sort of draw in students to share more of themselves within classes. So I know it's only a flavour today. There are lots of you, and there's absolutely no way we could have gone around everybody if everybody had put a slide in. But it was just to kind of show you yet another way that we can think about creating. But let's move to thinking a little bit more about, again, what's co-creation and what does it mean? How is it done in practice? And this is a sort of very loose kind of continuum that I created when I was tussling myself with kind of what are the differences between a lot of this terminology that's out there? You know, why am I talking about co-creation and not partnership? And so I sort of created this to go from one end of sort of student engagement, which is such a huge term that I think refers to, you know, everything from literally the student turned up to university. And I think, wow, that's a low level of engagement in my head. But we often refer to that in terms of students engaging with the university or students engaging by turning up to a lecture. So we're at quite a low level of engagement there, right through to people being so engaged that they're wanting to read more than is on the reading list. They're asking to design things that will be of benefit to future students or to the university. So it's a big, broad area involving kind of what the student does, what the institution does. It's also broad in the sense that it often refers to student representation as well as what's going on within classrooms. So I think sometimes I find it can be a helpful term, but it's a very broad definition. And so if we look at the other end, a partnership often has implications of equality. And that sometimes makes people a little bit nervous. If you're assessing somebody's work, people are occasionally a little bit sort of, well, I don't know whether I can claim partnership with this. Or perhaps you're working in partnership at certain points of a piece of work, but not all the way through. So that's why sometimes I quite like in between that sort of co-creating learning and teaching, to me, sits somewhere between those. And I think it doesn't always imply that kind of equality that you might see in partnership, but it definitely does imply more than what I would call just active learning, for example, where students are active and they're involved meaningfully within their learning. But co-creation to me involves more negotiation and shared decision making than you might see in active learning. But as I say, might fall short in terms of equality. So it's very loose as a sort of set of, if you like a continuum or a set of definitions, but I found it helpful to try and sort of distinguish those. So I occasionally slip between partnership and co-creation, but I do often use co-creation because I think sometimes people beat themselves up a little bit about, you know, I don't think the work I'm doing is partnership or isn't as good as partnership, and yet they're doing fantastic work. So let's have a few examples of co-creation to sort of bring this to life a little. So one example is where a small group of students who had previously studied an education course in the United States, this Elon University in North Carolina, where Peter Felton is, who you've heard mentioned a few times from Maurice already. So they involved some students who'd already studied the course, and they involved some students who were going to be studying the course. So this is a selection of students. And so they kind of all got together to talk about the textbook for this course, because basically the students had said, we get really annoyed that you ask us to buy this book. We don't find it helpful. And so actually the students were involved in a curriculum design committee where they created a rubric together with the staff, where they were able to then judge the kind of quality of textbooks. And they gathered together textbooks from across the US that were used in initial teacher education courses. And they took 3 of those books home each over Christmas. And that was the staff and the students looked at those 3 books and judged them against a rubric. And then obviously where they got very poor scores, they rejected those books quite quickly. And then they were left with a smaller group of books to think about, well, which of these would suit us best for a new course? And I think a really successful piece of work that they did, but I think there are some elements of what made that successful. One was that on that committee, they had more students than they had staff. And that's unusual because I think a lot of committees, staff outnumber students. Those students very early on realized that they were being taken seriously when the previous textbook was rejected very quickly. And I think they were like, oh, okay, so we are being listened to. And I think that gives a lesson of the importance of it being an authentic piece of work where you are working in collaboration together and listening and respecting each other and actually acting on one another's views and perspectives. So a nice example there of kind of co-creating a curriculum. They did more than just choose the textbooks, but those textbooks are a good example of what they were doing. Another example involving just a few students is a couple of students who were studying maths at Loughborough University, who were found certain parts of the curriculum very, very difficult to understand, went to textbooks, couldn't find what they were looking for, spoke to staff about these concepts that they were struggling with. And so actually, had sort of trouble with these parts of the curriculum. And they said, wouldn't it be easier if we created some worksheets for first years next year about these topics so that they don't struggle the way that we do? So a very altruistic couple of students thinking about those students who would follow them. And they worked along with staff to create these lovely worksheets which enabled those students to try to learn those concepts more easily than they had been able to do. Another example comes from the University of Edinburgh, and this is where a couple of colleagues from medicine and also in the School of Education got together in response to some medical students saying, we're really surprised there isn't very much about healthy exercise as part of a medical curriculum, because that is often seen as one of the key things that we will encourage people to do as a preventative approach in medicine. And so they invited students from each of the years of the medical curriculum to come together to create some videos about physical exercise that could then be used in a sort of flipped classroom approach, that the students would look at those videos before coming to a class, and then they would have in-depth discussions about that work in the classroom time. And the students also created a video. They came up with the idea themselves, but to create a video that would help students make the most of a flipped approach to learning. So how to use the videos and how to make the most of them in order to learn most effectively. So a really lovely piece of work there from some colleagues in Edinburgh. And the final example on this particular slide comes from Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, and this is Alison Cook-Sather, who many of you will probably have heard of, and she was one of the first people to come up with a scheme she called Students as Learners and Teachers, which is a scheme basically where students are part of a team coming together to help observe observe teaching staff doing their teaching. So they would pair up, a student and a teacher would pair up for the semester, usually a student that's not studying that particular subject, and they come together and have regular meetings and talk and reflect on, talk about and reflect on the teaching that's taking place and how well the teacher is engaging the students. A really lovely scheme that's then been kind of replicated in a number of other places. So there's a few examples, but they're all examples where just a few students are invited to be part of that work. And I'm going to come on to why I've separated those out differently here than some other examples we'll come to shortly, where perhaps whole classes of students are involved, because I think they differ in some way. So some of the benefits that have been written about in terms of, and here I'm shifting to partnership because this is where the literature has actually often looked at partnership rather than co-creation in terms of the benefits. But what you're seeing is enhanced engagement, so enhanced motivation and learning, a deeper metacognitive awareness from students in terms of their own learning, and also a sort of more developed sense of identity, and improved teaching and classroom experiences. And interesting in those findings actually were that those benefits are actually seen for staff and students. So that metacognitive awareness, for example, is of learning for students, and for staff is often of learning and teaching, so why they teach in particular ways, and it helps them to explore that further and be more aware of their own teaching approach and why they teach the ways they do. In addition, a systematic review that was done by Lucy Mercer-Matston and a range of colleagues from around the world in 2017 added to that as well, that students also were seeing enhanced academic performance, an enhanced sense of belonging, confidence, and also enhanced relationships and building of trust. So lots of positivity from looking at some of those examples of partnership working. You know, plenty of growing evidence, I would say, for sort of real benefits that come from that. And in that systematic review, one of the key themes that came out very specifically in it was that there seemed to be a focus in a lot of the literature and research that had been done on partnership activities that were small scale. They tend to be undergraduate level. They often are extracurricular, but also focused on teaching and learning enhancement. And that might seem like a bit of a contradiction, the extracurricular and the focused on teaching and learning enhancement. But some of that was about how they defined extracurricular. And it was defined mainly from a student's perspective, that if the student who was involved in a partnership piece of work wasn't actually studying that particular program, then they would see it as extracurricular. So for example, if you're involved in a curriculum planning committee, I as a teacher would see that as curricular, but the students involved, unless they were studying the program that was under review. So for example, if they'd taken the program last year and were looking back at it from a curriculum planning committee, they were saying, well, that's extracurricular because it's not my current study. So apologies for the complexity there, but I think that might have explained a little of the contradiction there between extracurricular and the focus on teaching learning enhancement. But the key thing here really is that what they found was a lot of the partnership activities were small scale in terms of involving 1 or 2 students. And that led me to kind of really think about, we seem to not be talking much about whole class, either partnership or co-creation. And so I've been kind of looking at that a little bit more in the last few years. And I would see whole class co-creation as learning and teaching, which is inviting a whole group of students who are studying together in any teaching setting. So that can be face-to-face or online, but getting them to actively collaborate and negotiate with the teacher and each other on elements of the learning process. So that group could be a tutorial group, which is essentially a subset of a whole cohort, or it could be the whole cohort if you are teaching that cohort all at once. What I'm suggesting is that each of those times we come together with a group of students to work with them as a whole to do co-creation is a different form of co-creation than these examples where we're selecting 2 or 3 students to do something. So let's have a look at a few whole class examples. So one example here is from a colleague, Ignacio Canales, who's from, well, he was at St Andrews University, recently moved to the University of Aberdeen, and he runs a business course, an entrepreneurship course. And what he does is he asks his students, they come along for the first few weeks, it's pretty standard lecture tutorials. And then by the 3rd week, he says, you now know what your group project is going to be for your assessed piece of work. So we need to now get together to think as a class, what do you need to learn about in order to do your group project successfully? And so they then have a big conversation and share ideas about sort of what they need to know. And then he says to them, well, who's going to teach what? And he says, I'm really happy to teach things. So if there are difficult things that you want me to teach, but I would like you to sort of share out between you some of the other things, to go away, find out about them, and to think of creative ways you can teach them to the rest of the class. So essentially the rest of the class is co-created, and that's a lovely example of, you know, coming together to co-create learning and teaching. Another nice example comes from Uppsala University in Sweden, and colleagues in global environmental history do what they call the missing perspective. And what they talk about when they describe this is leaving 1 or 2 classes at the end of the semester clear, and then posing to students the question of what have we missed and what perspective have we missed. So it could be a topic we've missed that we really ought to cover, or it could be that we've covered a topic but we've not actually thought about it from a different angle. And so students are then actively involved in deciding what should fill those kind of final classes. The next one I don't need to explain to you because I've just talked about the shared PowerPoint approach. And it's another example of involving a whole class in co-creating what takes place in learning and teaching. Then another example is about designing sort of co-creating essay questions. And Professor Peter Kruszwitz, who used to be at Reading University, now at Vienna University in Austria, uses this with his students and has used it for quite a long time now, and provides his students with 6 to 8 keywords so that they don't go off topic, but that enables them to choose areas which they're more interested in. And so he says, having done this, what he tends to find is that the students are far more motivated and interested in what they're doing. And he's seen over time quite a significant, I was going to say significant, it is significant actually statistically, but he's seen a grade point average increase in his students. And what I was meaning to say was consistently. So this, over time, he has seen that consistently, that their grade point averages increase very slightly. And he thinks it's absolutely just to do with that greater engagement and motivation from them being involved. And another final example here, which involves a whole class, is a colleague from the University of Glasgow, Donald Ballance, who's based in engineering. He has 400 students, and he said, you know, I really want to do some kind of co-creation with this class, but it's a lot of people and that feels really complicated. How am I going to do it? And so he started by actually saying, well, one thing I could do is ask the students their view as to which of the different assessments that there are, what kind of weighting should they be given? And sorry, I realize that should say assessment weighting rather than exam weighting. And so the students vote. There are 4 different assessments. I think there's a poster, there's an exam, there's a lab report, and there's something else which has gone from my head just at this minute. And basically each year he says that the students vote slightly differently for what they prefer. And he says, you know, he explains to them, if you say 100% exam, you're not going to have 100% exam, but because you're going to get all 4 of these different assessments, but you can influence how much it's worth. If you don't like exams or you really like exams, you can influence it. And he says one of the most interesting things about this is that the weighting doesn't change hugely each year, but he says the students so appreciate it because they say, you asked us and you actually gave us an opportunity to give our opinion and our voice into this process. So some really interesting examples, all very different, of where a whole class is involved in that co-creation. What I also did was pull together a whole range of the work that's out there where people are doing whole class co-creation to look at what kind of findings there were in terms of outcomes and benefits. And I'm not going to go through all of this. I appreciate there's a huge amount on the slide, but what you were saying was a lot of similar outcomes to those findings of partnership, but specifically in whole class co-creation, an awful lot around the process being fun, opening up the learning process to being more transparent, and that kind of sense of increased ownership and learning by doing and learning creatively. So lots of real positives, but also some of you with a sharp eye might spot some of the things at the bottom there around, but it felt risky and unpredictable, or for teachers feeling that the challenge is in getting the pace of the teaching right when you do this. So it's not necessarily easy, and there are some kind of challenges, but so again, lots of very beneficial outcomes that are coming from the work. So a couple of sort of final things before we sort of move to having a chat with one another in some breakout groups. One of the things about whole class co-creation is, could we argue that it's perhaps more inclusive than some of the project-based partnership work that's been going on, where we're only inviting 2 or 3 students to be involved? So that's one kind of motivation perhaps to be thinking about, should we be involving a whole class? But we also have to then question, are all those students actually really engaged in the class? How do we ensure that if it's a whole class, we really are inclusive of everybody? So it's really important that we get to know all the students in a class in order to kind of think of ways that we're going to engage students and create a diversity of different ways in which we can encourage students to engage and co-create with us. One method might not work for everybody. So thinking of different roles, different types of co-creation can really then perhaps appeal to different students. And we may need to think about taking active steps to include those who might typically be less engaged. So yeah, I'd like to suggest that it might be possible that whole class co-creation could be more inclusive. But it's not to take away from the fact that those project-based partnerships are doing excellent work, and therefore actually having perhaps both alongside each other might be a way of being even more inclusive. I think ultimately we need to kind of really focus on the fact that the professor or the teacher really must genuinely value everybody's presence in a group or in a class. There must be this ongoing recognition that everyone influences the classroom dynamic, that everybody contributes to this. And I can usually not get through a set of slides without quoting bell hooks, but I think, genuinely, we have to show that we can all benefit from actually, hearing from all those different perspectives in a class. So you've heard me talk for quite a long time, so I'm going to pause at this point, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into some breakout groups very shortly. You'll be in groups probably of about 3 or 4 people, And what I would like you to do, and you might want to make a note of this, because I can never work out in all the different kind of Zoom and Collaborate and MS Teams and all the different functions, you will probably lose the slide. So what I wanted to say is you might want to make a little note of the 2 questions, or the 2 things that we'd like you to be thinking about are, which examples that you've heard of this morning might you think could they be adaptable to your context, and why were you attracted by, for example, one of the examples or 2 of the examples? But also think, importantly, what are you doing already in co-creation? Because I'm aware that we've got lots of colleagues here who are trying lots of really great things in their practice. So what are you doing, or what have you been involved in? And if we've got any students with us today as well, you know, what have you experienced of co-creation so far? And share that with one another. So introduce yourselves briefly, and then I'd like you to kind of focus on doing each of those questions, if you would. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing, but that's the task. I hope that that's relatively clear. I wonder whether anyone would like to share anything that you were discussing in your breakout groups. Would anybody like to share whether that's any of the examples I shared with you that you're thinking you'd like to adapt for your practice, or if you were sharing a nice example of co-creation that you're doing in your own practice? Anybody willing to come off camera and not off camera, sorry, off mute, and share their work? Moira's got a hand up.
Well, I'll have to find out about Padlet. There's another piece of software. So that'll be what I'll do after today. I was talking to Maria from Sligo, and I would always leave some space for, I teach social care law, it's very dynamic, it's always changing. So is there anything that you'd like to cover? So we might be, you know, have covered a particular piece of human rights, and I'd say, wait, who wants to do the law of war? So I'd go, yep. I'd give people options. 2 things. Maria was saying how her postgrads, all up for it. Undergrads, no thanks. This is your job, get on with it. Tell us what we're going to do. There is a thing that when students, it's perfectly human, when they go, I don't have to do this, therefore I'm not going to do this. So there's a problem with leaving it to the end of the semester, I suppose, to sort of build in options. I have done also, how do you want to be assessed? But I have quite a lot to say about that, because it can suit a lecturer and a student to go, I'll do a multiple choice. I think that, as well as kind of saying, these are the options for how you're assessed, you have to share your view of those assessments. So it'll be much easier for me and for the students to do a multiple choice than to do a 2,500 word essay with referencing and me mark those and give them one-to-one comments and feedback. But if I know that they're not doing a lot of writing, and that honing their writing will stand to them, then I need to share that discussion. So actually this stuff takes time, is I think what I'm saying. And also that when I have done that, in the end, there are those plus and minuses to different types of assessment, or different types of whatever, whether it's curriculum development or assessment or whatever. And those pluses and minuses need to be shared if you're going to do it on a basis of some kind of honesty. And students can say, right, where's the democracy in that? And somebody asked the question, is there a maximum number of students for whole class? One of the problems, of course, is how democratic is this? So you get 50% of students who go, I don't care, I much prefer to do a 1,000 word problem-based question, even though there's a greater risk of failing if I get it wrong. And then 50% of the class want to do a 2,500 word discursive essay where they're less likely to fail. Yeah. Then how do you resolve that? So those are discussions we had.
Great discussions, Moira. And I think I picked up actually two points from the chat. You've picked up on 2. So one came from Sinead about, is there an optimum number of students to have in a class in order to do kind of co-creation? And I think it has to be easier with smaller numbers, definitely. I think almost everybody would admit that. But I think even if you've got a class of 500, I think this is about, there are things you can do to move towards shared decision making. So it might not feel like everything is completely democratic in that class. And actually with 500 people, that's going to get pretty messy. And messy can be good, but, not out of control completely. Might be sort of mayhem we might end up with. Or you end up with a group of people who are not so engaged because they can get lost more easily in a group of 500. So you've got to think of ways of structuring that. And actually technology can really help you, I think, when you've got the big classes. So optimum number, I could pluck a number from the air, but there is actually an article from the US. It's quite old now, but by an author called Cuseo, C-U-S-E-O. I'm sure I could dig it out and share it, but who actually argues that the optimum class size is 15. And I find it's a fascinating article how they managed to say 15, not 14, not 16, but 15. And that's not in terms of co-creation, that's just an optimum class size. But you can think about how much easier it is to do co-creation perhaps with 15 students than it might be if you have 80 students. And just, yeah. So difficult to answer, is there an optimum size? But yes, size definitely has an impact on what you can do. And also, I think Helen brought up the idea of struggling to do this with first-year undergraduates versus postgraduates. And obviously, there's something about investment in your learning that a postgraduate often is more invested, but that's a big generalization from my perspective. And I think we have to be careful that thinking first-year students aren't ready for this, or first-year students have had a particular style of schooling, when actually I think, I can't remember who wrote about how, I think it's within the first 5 or 6 weeks of university, we've already kind of institutionalized students into a particular way of learning and teaching. So I'm a big believer in start soon, start as early as you can, because you're then creating the mindset that these are all legitimate ways of learning and teaching. And so where you can, I think it's great to start that early. But sorry, that's a long sort of response from me, because there were a couple of really good questions there in the chat. Thank you, those of you submitting those. I wonder whether we could come to, we've probably got time for one more to hear back from another group, if anybody wanted to share any other kind of ideas or discussions that you were having. And great to see sort of some of the chat that's going on. This is really helpful. Yes, the PeerWise tool Sinead's mentioned there, that's a great tool for sort of helping students kind of design questions and answer each other's questions and things. But yeah, any other comments from any of the other groups? Does anybody else want to give an example or share what you were talking about? Peter, do you want to come in?
Okay, just one of the things that we were talking about was the reluctance of students to engage in groups and to get, which again is going to affect the whole kind of co-creation thing. I think that raised for me the whole question, what the thing you just mentioned about starting early, but the whole thing about the course culture. So you have the one module that's trying to do adventurous stuff, you can often get some stick, both from students who want an easier life and from other staff who feel that you're pushing the boat out too far.
Yeah, really, really helpful comment, Peter. I think, yeah, absolutely about setting the tone, and that's going to come, we're going to have this conversation after the break, I think, around the importance of that environment that you create that makes it somewhere people want to participate or are willing to engage. I think that's such an important part of what we're doing, because otherwise, yeah, we're not going to get much back. And I find it fascinating to hear from, I've spoken to 2 colleagues this week, one of whom says students are saying to us that they really, really appreciate breakout rooms online at the moment because it gives them a chance to speak to other students and just have a bit of social contact. And another colleague who said the students are telling us they hate the breakout rooms because they're forced to actually do something. And to me, you know, I'm constantly frustrated by hearing the second one of those examples, because I kind of think some of it's about maybe how we set it up, whether it's those early things like this morning asking you to type in very quickly in the text what your energy level is. It's a nice visual thing, but it's also one way you could use something like that with students, where it's saying, please do put something in the text box. You can do that, and starting to use those kind of small activities to urge people in a little bit. So yeah, I think some of it's about how we set it up. It's not everything. We do occasionally have what I've often called sticky classes, you know, ones where you've tried to use the same thing you used last year that worked really well. You try it with this year's class, and it's, you know, it just is like the tumbleweed rolls across. So they do happen sometimes, you know, where you're going to have to work harder or try different things. But yeah, I think setting the tone is really, really important. Thanks, Peter. I can see that Zoe and Caroline have joined us as well, who I said were going to join us. So very good morning at a very early time for Zoe and Caroline. So let's think about relational teaching. I've chosen here a quote from Parker Palmer, whose work I really appreciate, but who says that real learning does not happen until students are brought into relationship with the teacher, with each other, and with the subject. We cannot learn deeply and well until a community of learning is created in the classroom. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think this is what I started to realize in the work that I was doing on co-creation, was that for me, relationships kept coming up again and again. And so it really started to make me realize that for co-creation, relationships are like a foundation. You can't really co-create something with students until you've built some relationships with them. And so let's look at also, I asked in the shared PowerPoint slides, I asked you to also share if you had any ideas of how you would define or represent relational teaching. So if we go back to, and this is me doing my juggle again, if we go back to our shared PowerPoint slides, I'll share these. I'm just going to call on one or two people again. So I'm going to come to Steve Rutherford's, actually. That was one of the ones I was quite interested in. And so poor Steve, because he's not here, but I was picking on him because I really liked his definition of relational teaching that he has here. So he says it makes him think of a teaching approach by which the teacher develops a connection with the learner, either through making the material relevant to their experience or by involving the learner actively in that experience. And the learning that comes out of this is a product of the trusting relationship formed between the two parties. And I really loved that recognition of how important trust is as part of relationships. So making a connection with a learner. So for me, there's something about what is teaching if we don't connect with our learners. I sort of feel that's a much less, powerful or effective way of teaching if we're not actually wanting to connect or managing to connect with our learners. So I really liked that in Steve's definition. As I say, someone else has perhaps removed a slide that was there. And I think what I like about that, I'm going to actually comment on that, is that one of the other slides I was going to call on that isn't there anymore. I like that someone feels able to sort of to realize, if you like, that I'm going to try and call on people, and is maybe thinking, I don't particularly want to share my perspective. And so it's respecting that when you do co-creation, that there's going to be points in time where people don't feel as comfortable to kind of highlight their work in front of others. And so I think having some sensitivity to that is actually really important. So that's why I don't need to mention the name of who I was going to call on, but it's kind of, that is interesting to me, that someone can feel able to sort of say, well, actually, maybe I'm not going to do that. So instead of that, let's go back to another one here. If we can go to, I don't know if Henry's with us. Is Henry with us?
Yeah, I am.
Would you like to say something about your relational teaching statement?
Yeah, I'm going to read it again.
Yeah, sure. Remind yourself.
I'm fairly new to teaching. I'm a PhD student, but I do teaching as well. I guess I'm more on the side of having been a student than I have, I suppose, being a teacher. And I did a level 3 award in education and training with City and Guilds a couple of years ago, which I loved, which is very much about kind of, student-centered teaching. So although I didn't come across terms like relational and co-creation, I'm really happy that I'm doing that today. But even though I am quite new to teaching, I think one of the things that was drilled in to us on that course was differentiation and kind of individual student needs. Especially, I used to work at City and Islington College in London, which has a really diverse student population, and I worked as a support worker, so I'm very conscious that students have a lot going on in their lives outside of education, and that part of your role as a teacher, apart from kind of subject related materials, is kind of adapting to those extra needs that students are bringing into the classroom all the time. So that was what came to mind when I put this down on the page.
That's great, Henry, and really lovely to hear from you as a newer teacher, because I think there's sometimes assumptions in co-creation that someone who's been teaching a longer time will be better at this somehow, or because they've got more teaching experience, they'll I don't know, have more ideas or be more adept at this. But actually, I think there's an argument to be said that if you're newer into teaching, maybe you don't bring lots of previous baggage with you about how teaching should be done or how teaching has worked for you in the past. So I actually really love the fact that you're newer to this, you're thinking about it, and that idea of being sort of responsive to, differentiating your teaching in ways to kind of meet the needs of your students, I think is such a powerful idea. And that's absolutely at the root of kind of getting to know your students and building relationships with them so that you can learn how to differentiate the teaching to kind of make it suit different students' needs. So thank you for sharing that. I really, really appreciate that. So let me stop sharing that screen a second. Okay. Thank you, those of you who didn't mind me calling on you. It's always a little bit tricky when I put people on the sort of the hotspot there. But really appreciate that some of you haven't minded me calling on you. So let's come back to the slides. And if you did do that work and created a slide and I didn't call on you this morning, sincere apologies. I do hope that don't mind that we couldn't get through everybody's slides this morning. I do appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your pictures of kind of what you think co-creational relational teaching is. But before we go further, I think, in thinking about relational teaching, what I'd love to do is to call on two absolutely fantastic graduate students, one now actually an alumni of Elon University, North Carolina. And I had the real privilege last year of being on a Fulbright scholarship at Elon University, and the privilege to teach on the Masters in Higher Education, which was just a wonderful experience. And I had the opportunity to teach one of the courses I taught was focused on co-creation and partnership. And within that course, I really wanted to try and sort of provide opportunities for us to explore what co-creation and partnership might mean, what that really is in practice. And so I'm totally delighted that two of the students who were on that course last year doing that Masters in Higher Education have agreed to come today to talk about what kind of co-creation and relational teaching means to them. So we've got Caroline Dean Glover and we've got Zoe Palamaki with us this morning, which as I say, it's very early in the States. So we're really, really grateful to Caroline and Zoe for joining us. So I'm going to kind of actually take the slides down just so that we can actually see you a little bit there in the sort of camera boxes. So let me just stop sharing for a moment. And then I'm going to hand over to Caroline.
Well, thank you so much, Cathy. And I just want to start off by saying thank you for inviting us both. This is such an amazing opportunity. It's very unique for us. So thank you so much for allowing us to come speak with you today. So when the question was posed of our experiences with relational teaching, I thought all the way back through my higher education career, now being a graduate of the master's program and working with students myself now and trying to think about the different ways that I've seen co-creation throughout different experiences. And three primary words came to mind when I was thinking about that I really wanted to highlight of what co-creation and relational teaching has become to me over the years. And the first is that it's very intentional. The second is that it's personal. And the third is that it's ongoing. And I thought of kind of three primary examples and stories from my life of how I've come to these conclusions of relational teaching. And so starting off with the importance of intentionality with relational teaching, actually my first experience with co-creation, the first time I interacted with it and really didn't even know what it was at the time, but saw it in action, was when I got paired with my undergraduate thesis mentor. This was back in 2016 at this point, which sounds like a really long time ago now. I was a sophomore in undergrad, and I got paired with Marianne Vandermoss-Peeler. And I remember walking into her office for our first thesis meeting, and I was really anticipating it to be like every other professor relationship I'd known up to that point, where she had an idea of what it was going to look like, and I was going to perform up to that point, and then she was going to grade me, and then we were going to turn it in, and her name was going to be on it, and I would be a co-author somewhere in the credits. And then when I sat down at her desk for the first time, I remember she looked at me, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Caroline, I need you to know that at the end of this, both of our names are going to be on this piece of work, and yours is going to be first." And that was really nerve-wracking for me, but she set the precedent that this was going to be a collaborative approach to writing this thesis, and it was going to be important that both of our voices were heard throughout this process. And that was the first time that I'd really seen collaborative work in that way. And I started to understand that relational teaching was about more than just me figuring out what the professor wanted. It was about me being part of the conversation and interacting in the work that was happening. My second experience with co-creation was in our class with Cathy, as she mentioned, in the master's program just last year at this point. And again, the whole course was focused around co-creation. So I had my different ideas of what the class was going to be like walking into it. It was not what I thought it was going to be like walking into it, because I remember the first day, we sat down and Cathy talked about a shared PowerPoint that we were going to be doing at the beginning of every class, similar to what you all had for this presentation today. And I was kind of curious about that. I'd never really seen that before. And I thought, okay, we'll talk about what we thought about the readings, or maybe respond to 3 questions that she'll pose to us. And she said, no, it's going to be about you. So where you like to vacation, what food you like to eat, what pets you have. And I didn't really understand why we were doing this at the beginning of class. I'd never seen that before. I was a little skeptical. But then as we got into week 2 or 3 of the class, I started to really learn things about my classmates that I had never known before. And some of these students I had been with for 1.5 years at this point, because it was in my last semester of the graduate program. So I really thought that I knew all I needed to know about my classmates, but that wasn't exactly true. And so I was finding out all of these different pieces about them and about Cathy. We started to relate in different ways and learn different things about each other. And I found that correlated to a deepening in our academic work as well. I started to care more about the work that we were putting out. I started to care more about which task each student was assigned to do, and if they actually wanted to do that or not, if that fit the personality traits that they'd been telling us in the PowerPoint slide. And it was really amazing to see how this simple act of just talking about ourselves at the beginning of each class deepened the work holistically and not just in our relationships with each other. So that's the personal piece. And then the third is that co-creation and relational teaching is ongoing. I really appreciated Henry talking about being newer to the teaching world. I am not a teacher per se, but I do help run a program of 150 students who intern in my city every summer. And we run programming with them to help them develop as young professionals in the area and as college students. And so I remember being hot off the master's program, and I just learned about co-creation, and I really wanted to use it in my new job with these 150 students. But up until this point, I'd only really seen relational teaching in this type of environment with one person, with my undergraduate thesis mentor, and at this point with a class of 15 master's students. So now I have 150 students who are anywhere from 18 to 40 years old, and was trying to figure out how to navigate this process. And I was really intimidated by it. But I remember at one moment in particular, my supervisor and I were talking about our logo for last summer. We were thinking, what is our logo going to be for the summer? What's our motto going to be for the summer for these students? And we were just toiling and pining over it. We couldn't really decide. And then it clicked. I was like, this is our co-creation moment. And we had a student who was working down the street from us. I said, we need to invite her into this conversation. She was a graphic design student. She was really creative and innovative. So we invited her down to the office, and she took a minute kind of thinking to herself. And then she drew up this beautiful logo of our city and all that it had to offer. And then above it, it said virtual but connected. A small side note, our program this summer was actually all virtual with our students. So we ran the entire thing online via meetings just like this. And so the slogan, virtual but connected, was extremely powerful for our students, and they really grabbed onto that. And we could have never come up with anything that good. It had to be a student who came up with that. So all the students really grabbed onto that, and that became a theme throughout the summer. They're saying we're virtual, but we still want to be connected with each other. So they were constantly wanting to get together for coffees, do surveys to help improve the program. And we found that each week we started changing the program more than we thought we were going to do. We met once a week for 10 weeks. And every week we would survey the students and ask them what we could do better. And that made for a really incredible summer program at a baseline, but especially being virtual. It was incredibly helpful for us to be able to adjust as we went along, because some things that we were doing were not working for students. They didn't like it, but we had no way to know that until we invited them into the conversation. So the third piece is really remembering that co-creation and relational teaching is ongoing. So those are kind of my main three takeaways: is the intentionality of relational teaching. I think that students can pick up kind of when you've thought about it beforehand or not, and they want to make sure that it's part of the classroom day one. I think it's especially difficult to kick in this type of methodology or teaching halfway through a class. The second is being personal. Students can also pick up when you mean it or not. And I know that I got called on it a few times this summer where I wasn't really invested and they told me. And then the ongoing piece, it's not a perfect science. You have to really keep working at it, and it's pretty messy, but the end result is really more meaningful overall. So speaking of the ongoing process, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Zoe. As Cathy had mentioned, we were in a class together in the master's program, and then she was also in the program that I helped run this summer. So it's amazing to see how we started co-creation in the class, but now we're still co-creating up until this day in all kinds of different ways. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Zoe.
Thanks, Caroline, and great job. It's interesting because Caroline and I had discussed previously about what this topic meant to us, and we hit along the similar points. So I just wanted to start off by saying thank you all for having us. I know Caroline already said that, but I'm also very appreciative to be here. When I was thinking about this topic of co-creation, I was really searching to think about prior to class, because when I think of co-creation, right off the bat, our co-creation class stands out. But I actually worked as an assistant and substitute teacher in Finland. I had the opportunity to do so. And when I was teaching there, unbeknownst to me at the time, I was experiencing co-creation. I didn't know it because I didn't really know the topic at that time, but I was. And so it was interesting to see how the students in Finland were able to shape the classroom experience based on their ideas, their needs, their desires. And so the students really, or the teachers really listened to what the students had to say and shaped their experience around what they wanted. So now coming back into my master's program, I wasn't even thinking about Finland at that time. I was thinking about me. I'm a student. And so I actually met Cathy in our winter term course where she was one of 3 instructors. And Cathy modeled relational teaching so well that out of those 3 instructors, I just gravitated towards her, so much so that when they offered a class that she was going to teach, I signed right up. And that was our co-creation class. So I think it's interesting because not only when she was my sole instructor, but also when she was one of 3, she stood out so much to me. In our class, what I loved right off the bat was we had a hand in our syllabus creation. I had never experienced that before. I came from a business background. I got my bachelor's in business administration. When I took my business classes, it was very much so, this is the teacher, you are the student, you sit there, you listen, you leave. It was not, what do you have to say? So when I entered higher education, I was not prepared for even the little co-creation that happens, but especially in this course. Having a hand in the syllabus creation made me feel more invested in my learning. I felt that I had created these goals and these outcomes for myself. I need to live up to those standards. And also, I appreciated that I had the opportunity to format how I wanted to learn. Usually it's dictated to you, and I was being asked, how do you learn the best? You know, how do you want to learn? So I really appreciated that. Like I said, I'd always seen there like a separation as like, this is a teacher, this is a student. And from day one, when I walked into our classroom, we were on an even playing field. I think the layout of a classroom, I know things are virtual right now, but the layout of a classroom is so important. When we walked into Cathy's class, it was not, I'm at the front of the room, you are sitting here. It was, we're all sitting around a table together. We were in like a rectangular, circular format. And so we could all see each other, and we weren't staring at the backs of someone's head, we were staring at their faces the entire class. Also, Cathy sat at the same level as us, and it really did feel like we were on an even playing field. I know that, you know, things are now virtual, but I actually think that helps, because look, we're all on an even playing field right now. We're all just boxes on a screen. So something to think about as we move forward currently in this virtual time. The main thing I gained from the class wasn't the content necessarily, which I did learn a lot, Cathy, I promise, but it was predominantly the confidence I gained, not as a student, but how I took that with me in my future endeavors. So you may not even notice how much you're impacting your students in the moment, but what they take with them as they move forward. So for example, I gained confidence in myself as a staff member, and in my next 3 internships, I've had 3 internships since the class, and in every single one, I have had a hand in how I structure my internship. I didn't go in and say, okay, I'm here, tell me what to do. I said, this is what I really want to get out of this internship. This is what I want to learn. And I co-created with my internship supervisors. So it's not just teachers and students. It can be supervisors and employees and many other ways. And lastly, I actually had the opportunity to teach this past fall, so last semester. I never thought I would teach, but I ended up teaching 13 first-year students, and they were all exploratory students, which means that they were undecided on their major. And so I was helping them just like figure out what they want to major in and what they see for themselves in the future. And I know I heard someone talk about like, what do you do when they don't want to co-create or they don't want to engage? Let me tell you, first-year students, they don't really want to engage as much. And I felt like sometimes it was pulling teeth, but I tried to model the behaviors that I saw in Cathy's class. Unfortunately, certain things are against you. During this time of COVID, I couldn't put everyone in a circle like I was planning. I had to stand up at the front of the classroom and speak to them where they felt like students. But I made sure to put a poll at the end of every single course saying, what did you learn? What do you want to know more about? How can we better this classroom experience? And I really tried as much as I could to let them have a hand in their learning. And like I said earlier, it may not feel like at the time they get it or they're listening or they appreciate you. But I had many students come up to me on the last day of class and say that it was their favorite class and that I was their favorite instructor, and that they learned so much and they're taking it forward. So just having perseverance, sometimes it can be tough, especially in these times where you're just staring at a screen and maybe people have their cameras on or they don't, or they're talking or they're not. I think that if you continue to model the behaviors, you never know the students that you're impacting and how they will go on to impact others. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Caroline. Sort of blushing slightly through some of that, but I think also wonderful to hear about kind of the impact that your experiences throughout your time at university are having on your kind of future life, your future career, your future way that you conduct yourselves. It's just, that's really inspiring. I wondered, while Caroline and Zoe are actually going to stay with us for the rest of the morning, but I wondered, while we sort of have you here, are there any questions anybody wants to ask Zoe or Caroline while they're here and while we have time? So does anybody want to ask anything about their experiences of co-creation or relational teaching? You have a prime opportunity to ask students their opinions or views or experiences. Would anybody like to ask anything? Feel free to either put your hand up or... Oh, Sinead.
Thank you, Cathy. I just wondered, I suppose I'm inspired and listening to you both, and I actually think I could see Cathy looking really proud as well as blushing, and I can understand why. I will be teaching a first year group, and I'm regularly teaching first year groups. And I'm a little bit inspired to try the shared PowerPoint, where we might all introduce ourselves and say where, you know, if we have a pet or things like that. But did you encounter any situations where maybe only a portion of the class got involved, and then did you chase up the others, or did you just leave them be, or how did you manage that maybe only some people participate?
So I'll take this.
Great.
And I'll say that the syllabus said participation, for example, was a major part of your grade. So that already, you know, was spelled out for the students. They knew that that was on them. But at the same time, I was a really nice professor, I think, or it's not a professor, I don't have a PhD, instructor. But I let them slowly get into it. I understood that these times especially are different than they're expecting. So instead of chasing them, I let them get comfortable first. And then I did see most of them would come out of their shells and engage. We actually started every single class with an icebreaker or like a community building activity. And so every single class we started with something different that got them all talking. And what I found is I kind of just tried to sit back and let them do and learn how they wanted to learn. So for example, my class, they did not like to be called on. They did not want to be the singular person talking. But if I broke them out into groups, they were little chatterboxes. So what I would do is I'd break them out into small groups, have them talk and have fun and engage. And then when they'd come back, they were already much more comfortable talking because they had just been that whole time. There's going to be students who don't want to engage. There's always going to be those. I tried my hardest. I put everything I could, but at the same time, they also have to be responsible for their decisions, because it's not just about them as first year students, but it's also about their growth when they become second year students and third year students, and then when they move on. So I gave them time and space and support, but at a point, they do need to do it for themselves. That's just my personal opinion. I know everyone teaches differently.
I agree with that, Zoe. And I think the one thing that I would add, especially during this time in the world and what students are dealing with, is that there's an array of reasons why students aren't engaging. They could be having things going on at home. They could have a sick family member. They could just be confused. We've all been there this year. And so I think what we tried to do in the program was we actually scheduled, I'm not sure how this would look for you all, but we did calls with each student. They were 10 minutes long. Just to check in with them, and they could sign up. And we tried to kind of co-create with them during that time. What challenge are you facing? And what is one thing that we could do to move in the right direction? So if you're having a hard time talking to people, could you put one thing in the chat during our class? And that would be a really great success for you. Or are you having a difficult time navigating professional development? Okay, send one email to someone you want to meet this week. And that was really helpful because they all had a different barrier they were trying to overcome. So just really kind of honing in on that and having best intentions with students, because they're all trying, but it looks different right now just based on what they're facing.
And sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say also anonymous feedback. I tend to feel that when people think their name is being associated with their, feedback, they get a little hesitant. So if you really want honest feedback, I tend to do it anonymously.
It's a really good point, Zoe, and actually speaks really well to the shared PowerPoint that I used today, which is sort of modeling all sorts of different things. But within that shared PowerPoint pack, there were a number of anonymous slides. There was also one that was labeled a change agent, was the name that was in there, which I loved. So there's a stealthy change agent somewhere amongst you. We didn't call on you on this occasion. And this is where, in a class that's going on for a number of weeks, I would hope that I would call on everyone. So obviously there's a bit of a challenge today where I'm only calling on one or two people that, you feel you're leaving people out. But also there were quite a lot of people who were here today who didn't have a chance to do a PowerPoint slide. And I could start the session and get all angsty and sort of say, oh, lots of you didn't do your homework, but it depends on the tone you want to set. And actually it doesn't matter in the sort of context we're in that people didn't have a chance to do that. And I think the realism of, we didn't give you very long to do it. People have got lives and there are lots of things going on for folks. I think just really kind of trying to meet people where they're at and acknowledge that there are lots of reasons why, in the same way not everybody did the PowerPoint slide today for here, there's loads of reasons why students sometimes don't engage. And I think to try to sort of start out from a point of trust, rather than sort of thinking, well, oh no, I've got a big class of disengaged students, is to sort of start and encourage people to gradually get more and more involved. And also to explain why you're doing particular things. I think that can help. So if we were to have a second session, I would predict that we'd probably get more slides in the PowerPoint pack. So it's those kind of just taking time to kind of enable people to be involved, I think is really important. Okay, well, carry on. I'm going to move on to kind of doing a little bit more about relational teaching, and Caroline and Zoe are staying with us, so we can always have a little bit of time at the end. If you think of something you wished you'd asked, then there will be a little bit more sort of question time at the end. And thank you again, Caroline and Zoe, for your insights. Really lovely to hear from you both. So let's share screen again. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the screen with the lovely pictures of Caroline and Zoe. So as we move into thinking about relational teaching, as I say, I kind of made this real sort of realization that, in order to do co-creation with a whole class, we need really positive relationships. It's a sort of foundation, but also this is a relationship that sort of is cyclical, because if you do co-creation, I think it also builds really positive relationships. So yeah, sort of I really came to this realization when I started thinking about it, that we need relationships in order to do kind of co-creation effectively. It's like a kind of foundation, if you like, but also that by doing co-creation, that also builds really positive relationships. So it's a sort of, it's self-fulfilling and cyclical. It kind of, those relationships are needed, but you also enhance them through the process of co-creation. And this is not new about relationships. There is masses of evidence that student-staff relationships are key to kind of successful outcomes for students. So a lot of this evidence is also quite dated. A lot of this comes from the States. And the suggestion is that the more positive that student-staff relationships are, the more you'll see academic success. Students tend to gain higher aspirations for their education. They have greater personal and intellectual development, greater student satisfaction, enhanced motivation. So, lots of positives coming here, but this is from sort of constructive, positive student-staff relationships. And it might not be any surprise to realize staff characteristics, attitudes and personality actually have some impact on this. And I'm sure Zoe and Caroline would have opinions on this, and any of us who've ever studied and have had different teachers would realize that there's a lot of evidence that teachers who are warm and informal, friendly, flexible, accessible and approachable, available, empathetic, genuine and respectful, understanding and honest, these are actually sort of characteristics, attitudes and personalities that tend to lead to more positive outcomes for students. So, if we could wave a magic wand, I'd love to kind of say every single teaching member of staff at the University of Edinburgh would hold all of these different characteristics, but I'm a realist as well, in that we're all very different as teachers, and that doesn't always come across. Actually, I think in an institution like Edinburgh, which is a research intensive institution, we face those challenges that you have in other research intensive institutions of having staff who haven't come necessarily to teach in the institution. And therefore, you know, actually sometimes I would just like some of those staff to if they would like students, that would be a first step. And that feels like a very low level threshold. But there's something for me about, you know, to work in a university, even if you're a research member of staff and you're coming into contact with students, I think you really need to think about treating students respectfully and actually have a belief in students' capabilities. So there's something here for me. These characteristics and attitudes are so important for teaching staff, but really are important for staff across an institution. So building relationships, one of the things that I think is really critical is to think about that first 5 minutes when we meet a new group of students, or when we meet a student for the first time outside of a teaching setting, is to think about what do we communicate in those first minutes? Do we give a sense that if a student asks a question, that that question is welcome, or whether it's a little bit frustrating because you were trying to speak? And I think that tone is, you know, given off very, very quickly. Do you speak to students in a physical setting outside the class before they arrive, or do you keep yourself to yourself and just, you know, keep you're checking things on your phone or whatever? But actually that period of time outside the classroom can be really important for kind of starting to build relationships. So similarly in an online space, think about whether, do you arrive early? Do you encourage your students to come early if they want to have a chat? But each new class you have is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for building trust and respect. It's an opportunity actually for us to demonstrate to students that we care, and we care about how they do in their achievements, but we care about them as a person. And actually, I don't think necessarily that teachers are always good at sort of demonstrating that care. So I do get upset when I hear from students that they're surprised sometimes to hear that a teacher cares about them and about their performance and about their progress and about what they want to do when they leave university. So I think we could be better at doing some of this, and that's where I think Elon University, it has a very good reputation for engaged learning, and I think they do very well at doing some of this work around building trust and respect and really demonstrating that they care about students. So something that I think, you know, we can all work on. And one small thing when we talk about kind of trying to use that first 5 minutes well and trying to kind of really communicate how we care is the impact of a small thing, which is about learning students' names. So there's this amazing piece of research that's come from Arizona State University, where they had large biology classes. So we're talking in a big lecture theatre, hundreds of students, and they started using what they called name tents. So just imagine a sheet of paper folded in half kind of lengthways, which the student writes their name fairly large on the front of that. And they would ask the students to put those in front of them on the kind of the desks in the lecture theatre. And what they actually found in the research that they did in doing this over a period of time in their classes was that those using name tents seemed to increase students' motivation and learning, which seems incredible, but this is all about the building of community within a classroom. It made it more likely that those students would seek help from the faculty members, from the teachers, and it also, maybe less surprisingly, helps students to get to know one another, because sometimes we're forgetting that it's not just about a teacher getting to know the students, but the students also, if they're in a class that's large, they may not know each other very well either. So really impressive outcomes from this study that they did at Arizona State University. But the gold dust is still to come, because what they also found was that faculty need to try to learn names and make efforts to kind of call on the students by their names, but they don't actually need to remember all the students' names. And what I mean by that is that the students actually said that they, you know, they're smart. They know that you're not going to remember 500 students' names. But they said the fact that the teacher was calling them by name when they wanted to ask a question, or would make an effort to sort of say, please remind me of your name when they ask them to speak. They said they know that, you know, the teacher's not remembering all those names, but the fact that they were trying and asking and trying to learn names seemed to be significant. So there's something in there about the message of, we do understand as human beings the capacity that we have for being able to learn names in a large class, but those students are feeling there's a qualitative difference between the teacher that tries to learn those names and makes that effort from one who isn't doing that. And I think that's just absolutely fascinating in terms of those small things we can do to sort of set the tone and communicate that we actually care about getting to know students a little. And so if we look at some of the research, it's pretty straightforward that the more contact that we have with students and faculty outside and inside the classroom, the greater students' development and satisfaction. So I've talked very much about inside the classroom today, but this is something that's also really important round and about universities, outside class time, and to try and think of ways that we can kind of create opportunities for conversations between students and staff, and students and teachers. So really important to kind of remember that it's not that sort of one way and only in classrooms. So let's move once again to thinking about having some conversations with one another. And so very shortly, we're going to put you into breakout groups again for about 10-15 minutes. And what we want you to think about this time is the two questions we've got are, how do you create hospitality in the first 5 minutes? That might be in a classroom, or it might be in the first 5 minutes you meet students in another setting, depending on where you're working. How do you set the tone? Like, how do you ensure that that tone is creating the environment that you want to create, that's a trusting environment? And also the second question, what examples do you have of building good relationships between staff and students? So anything that you've been doing that you think works well. So once again, you might want to jot down those questions, because as I say, you might lose the slide when we go into the breakout groups. So first one there, how do you create hospitality in that first 5 minutes? How do you set the tone? And the second question, what examples do you have of building good relationships between staff and students? Like, what works well that you've tried? So I'm just giving you a second to jot those down. Hopefully some of you are doing that. And then I'll very shortly stop sharing my screen so that we can go into the breakout groups. Once again, I'll send you the Padlet link, because we can also, just going to stop sharing, hoping you've managed to put that down. I'll share the Padlet link again. Oh, thank you. Linda has shared the Padlet link. And you should note on that, that should be question 3 and 4 this time. So have the conversation in the group amongst yourselves. If you have a chance and you'd like to type in some responses to what you're talking about within the Padlet, please do that. If you don't have a chance to do the typing up, that's absolutely fine. But make it, you know, the important bit is having the conversations with your colleagues. So hopefully everybody knows what's happening. And the slides, I've got various things with references, etc. I'm just going to stop sharing. We can get the slides round to everybody afterwards. If I send them to Will and colleagues, I hope perhaps we can get those out to people. But I'm going to pause at this point, because we've probably got a few minutes. If anybody had any sort of last questions that you wanted to pose to either myself, to Zoe or Caroline, before I kind of hand back to Will and Maurice.
I just wondered, sorry to interrupt, Cathy, amazing session. I have really enjoyed it, but I just wondered, in addition to sharing the slides, might you also share some of the suggestions coming up on the Padlet? That it would be useful to have those.
Yes, of course. In fact, what I'll do is I'll wait for all the sort of last minute, you know, the last comments to come in, and I'll download that actually as a PDF so that that can be sent around to everybody as well. Thanks for the reminder, Sinead. That's great.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, very happy. Any other comments or questions as we finish up? Thank you so much for all your contributions, everybody. It would have been a much less fruitful session this morning if we hadn't had the kind of contributions that you made. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Thanks from me to Zoe and Caroline for getting up very early and contributing your thoughts to the session. I certainly found those helpful, and I can see from kind of various things in the chat that other people found that really helpful too. So I think, unless there's any other burning questions, I'm going to pass back to Will and Maurice to sort of wrap us up, I think.
Cathy, thank you. And it's, I suppose what would be customary now is if we were in a seminar room or something, we would certainly want to give you a round of applause. And so, folks, I'm going to suggest either we use the reactions or maybe turn our cameras on and just give a quiet or muted set of applause to our presenters. Thank you so much. I love it, Kate. Yeah, Anne's here, sort of waving as well. Great. Thank you. I'm not even going to try to pull together my thoughts on that at the moment, because the Twitter has been alive, the chat has been alive, the Padlet has been flying with things, and I know there is so much for us to sort of digest there. Cathy mentioned she's going to share the slides with us. We think that we've managed to, despite some challenges with Zoom settings, we think we've managed to capture the chat as well. So we'll be pulling together that. For colleagues who are from MTU, you will know that all of our resources sit on our Teaching and Learning Unit website. And again, Linda might pop up the link for that. So colleagues who are not part of MTU, you can sort of see some of the things that we're doing, and you might even be able to dip in and look at some of the resources that we've got, and maybe share back with us some of your resources as well. But at as I introduced Cathy, I said I was drawing back on some of the Twitter comments that were taken from her session at the RAISE conference in 2019. And I was just looking back at those. I think we have indeed heard from a leading light in student engagement. On that continuum somewhere, Cathy, student engagement, action learning, co-creation, partnership, I think we've heard from a leading light in those spaces. The way that you've weaved in, subtly in some cases and really explicitly in others, ways in which those different and diversity of ways that we can engage, you've done that for us in this session as well. And thank you for helping us experience that. I hope folks have taken something from that. And I was saying we were taken back to that conference, where it's probably one of the last big conferences that I was at before lockdown happened, and that time of being able to connect over coffee, walking between rooms, sitting down at tables and having a chat. And we've had a different type of experience today, but I do hope that colleagues, you've managed to find some of those connections in some of those breakout rooms. Maybe you found a new person to follow on Twitter, or even a new person to hound, to go and follow up with some ideas. Please carry on those conversations. We would love to hear from you about how you are using some of the ideas that Cathy has shared with us. And I just wanted to end by from a little quote that one of Cathy's really great colleagues, and it was on Twitter, sort of connected to that conference, and it was from Peter. It was a tweet from Peter Felton, and I just thought, yeah, I wonder if we can try and do this from what we've heard, from what Cathy shared. And Peter was saying it only takes meeting that one person who ignites a fire within you. How can your classroom be that space? And Cathy, I just want to say thank you for giving us the chance to think how we, in all of our different settings as educators, might start to think how we can ignite a fire for our colleagues, be they students or staff, but also how we might be ignited as well from comments and things from colleagues as well, be they students or staff. So folks, I do wish you a great rest of the week and safe travels, maybe down the stairs to get your lunch to wherever you're going next. Thank you.